Nebraska, 1885, people across the Loup River Valley watched a widow do something that made no sense. She was building her house out of the ground it stood on. Her name was Ada Lindqvist. She was 34 years old, Swedish-born, 14 months a widow, and everything she owned in the world came to $12 folded inside a tobacco tin. One trunk of clothes and bedding, a daughter named Ingrid, who was 8, and a shaggy yellow dog named Rusk, who had walked beside the wagon the whole 200 miles from the railhead. She also held title to a quarter section of grass south of the river, 160 acres without a single tree on it, and the loan of a breaking plow from the Brandt family 2 miles east. That was the whole of it. That was what the winter would be measured against. She was not supposed to be on that land at all. Her husband had died of a fever the autumn before, and the timber claim he had paid on for 3 years, good bottomland with cottonwood and ash, the kind of claim a family could burn and build from for a generation, turned out to exist mostly on paper. The land agent who had sold it, a smooth-shaved man named Silas Crane, who kept an office beside the lumber yard in town, produced documents showing the payments had never been properly filed. The claim reverted. The money was gone. Crane expressed his sympathies and made his offer in the same breath. "A woman alone will want 4 walls up before the snow flies," he said. "I can let you have the lumber on credit, on my own terms, and you may sign this afternoon." Ada listened to him with her hands folded, thanked him in her careful accented English, told him she believed she would keep her $12, and drove the wagon out to the treeless quarter that was all the law still allowed her. What she did next is the reason people talked about her until the end of their lives. She set the borrowed plow into the prairie and began to cut the ground itself into bricks. The plow turned a ribbon of sod 4 inches thick, dense as a rug, bound together by 10,000 years of grass roots. She cut the ribbons into blocks 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, each one weighing close to 50 pounds, and she hauled them on a sled made of planks and stacked them where her house would stand. She needed 900 of them. She counted them the whole time, so many cut, so many hauled, so many laid, because counting was how she kept her nerve. She laid the blocks grass side down, 2 courses side by side at once. The seams staggered like a mason's brickwork, and every 3rd course she turned the blocks crosswise to tie the double wall together. When the walls were done, they stood 36 inches through, 3 feet of packed earth and living root on every side of her daughter's bed. The valley had an opinion about it within the week. To understand the laughter, you have to understand the arithmetic those men were doing in their heads, because by their arithmetic they were right. It was already late August. Every settler in the valley was racing the same clock: haul enough wood, buy enough planks, get tight before the snow. A sensible widow, and the word sensible got used a great deal that month, would sign Crane's credit paper, raise a board and batten cabin in 2 weeks, and spend the rest of the autumn hauling deadfall from the river. Instead, this woman was spending whole days plowing dirt. Every day she gave the sod was a day she was not stacking firewood, and everyone knew a plank cabin ate wood all winter long. They watched her stack her dirt, and they concluded, kindly at first, that grief had reached her mind. Harlan Vogel, who kept the dry goods store and had a talent for saying out loud what other men only thought, drove out in September on the excuse of delivering flour. He stood by the rising wall for a while with his thumbs in his vest. The wall was as tall as his chest by then and thicker than the span of both his hands. "You mean to winter that child in this," he said. "In dirt. There is lumber in town and honest credit to buy it with. Why would a Christian woman bury her daughter in dirt?" Ada set the block she was carrying onto the course, pressed it with her knee, and gave him 4 words. Dirt doesn't burn wood. Vogel waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. He drove back to town and reported that the Swedish widow had gone strange, that she talked in riddles, and that her house looked like something an animal would dig. By October, the valley had settled on its name for the place. They called it the Gopher Hole. The other name, the one the women used more quietly, was a grave with a window. Hold that picture. A widow with $12, 900 blocks of cut prairie, and a valley full of people who pitied her. Because in January a storm was going to come down that valley, 3 days of it, wind you could lean on, snow driven so hard it worked through a keyhole. And when it finally passed and the neighbors dug up out of their drifts, every one of those pitying people was going to stand in the snow, look at what the storm had left of their own houses, and then look at hers. This is the story of the worst blizzard anyone in that county ever recorded, and of the one house that treated it like weather. The mockery did not stay gentle, because mockery never does once it has an audience. At Vogel's store, the men worked her over like a stove they could warm themselves at. A dirt house, they said, in the age of the railroad, with a lumber yard right there in town. One of them said you could tell how a marriage had gone by whether the widow built up or dug down. Crane, who heard all of it from behind his ledger, encouraged the joke every time it flagged, because every laugh was an advertisement for milled pine. He had reason to advertise. He had sold lumber that autumn to half the valley, most of it on credit at his interest, and the newest and proudest of those buildings stood a quarter mile from Ada's claim, the school teacher's house, board and batten, painted white, with glass in 4 windows and a shingle roof you could see from the section road. Miss Fenwick, the teacher, was a serious young woman from Ohio who kept a barometer and a good spirit thermometer and read journals about scientific housekeeping. She was not cruel. She simply knew things. And one of the things she knew, because a journal had told her, was that earthen dwellings bred damp, and damp bred sickness. She said so at church. A child wintered inside earthen walls, she said, will be coughing before Christmas, if the consumption spares her that long. And she said it while Ingrid stood close enough to hear. Children repeat what the grown people around them say, only louder. At the school that fall, Ingrid Lindfist was the girl from the Gopher Hole. She came home one afternoon in October with her lip bitten white, and asked her mother, "Why can we not live in a real house? A wood house, a house like the teacher has." Ada was mixing lime for whitewash. She wiped her hands and took her daughter by the wrist, and instead of answering, she walked her through what they had built, because Ada Lindfist did not argue with feelings, she could argue with facts. She had grown up with earth and turf. In the parish in Sweden where she was born, the old people kept root cellars dug into the hillsides, and she had spent whole childhood winters carrying potatoes out of a hole in the earth that never froze in January and never sweated in July, while the timber houses above it groaned and iced and burned through their wood piles. Her grandmother had a saying about it. The saying Ada had translated down to 4 blunt English words the day Vogel came with his flour. The ground does not care what the sky is doing. Dig into a bank in midwinter, and the earth a few feet down holds close to 50 degrees, all by itself, before you strike a single match. Her grandmother had not called that science. She had called it the reason old women outlive proud men. So Ada showed her daughter. She made her lay one small hand on the plank door Crane's yard had milled, already cold as a skillet in the October evening, and then pressed the same hand flat against the inside of the sod wall, 3 feet of earth still holding the ghost of the summer in it, faintly, stubbornly warm. She had her stand in the doorway and listen. Outside, the wind tearing at the grass. Inside, when Ada pulled the door to, a silence so complete Ingrid could hear the dog breathing. That is what a yard of prairie does, her mother told her. Wood is a fence against the weather. Earth is a refusal. What she did not say, because she did not know it yet, was that the argument would be settled in front of the whole valley by an instrument the schoolteacher herself would carry through the snow. Watch her work through September and October, because everything that happens in January is decided here. The walls came first, and the walls were a lesson in patience. 900 blocks, laid two abreast, grass side down, so the dead roots would knit into the course below, and the whole wall would slowly weld itself into a single piece of ground. She left the wall a hand higher than she wanted it, because a sod wall settles as it dries, tightening its own seams under its own tremendous weight. There is close to 90 tons of earth in a house like that, and 90 tons does not rattle. She cut her window openings deep and narrow, set the frames on pegs so the settling wall could slide past the wood without crushing it, and sloped the sills so the light spread. 2 windows and 1 door. Every opening in a wall is a wound in it, and she meant to have as few wounds as possible. For the roof she spent $2 of her $12, and that was the only lumber money Silas Crane ever got out of her. A cedar ridgepole and a set of second-hand rafters hauled from the river landing. Over the rafters went a lattice of willow brush, then a thick mat of slow hay. Then sod again, laid grass side up this time, so the roof itself would root and hold. Inside she stretched cheesecloth tight across the ceiling and tacked it to the rafters, a pale sky of cloth that caught the trickle of dirt a sod roof always sheds and let the lamplight bounce. She burned lime and whitewashed the inside walls twice, until the room was bright as a dairy. She packed the clay floor, swept it with sand, and laid rag rugs over it. People who finally stood inside that room in January expected a burrow. What they found was a white, quiet, level room that smelled of lime and bread. Then came the part of the ledger the men at the store never bothered to figure, which is strange, because it was only ever arithmetic. A board shanty on the open prairie, single-walled, seems shrinking all winter, will eat 4 cords of wood in a hard season and beg for more, because every stick of heat it makes leaks straight out through the boards. Ada's walls did not leak heat. They banked it. A full yard of earth takes a day's warmth into itself and gives it back all night, steady as a cellar, so the fire never has to fight for the same ground twice. She figured a quarter of the wood would do, 1 cord, hauled in 6 trips from the river, and to stretch even that she spent the last of October at the hay burner trade the Swedish and German families knew, twisting slow hay into hard cats. Each twist tight as a rope and dense as a stick of cordwood, stacked by the 100 in the lean-to she built against the north wall. Firewood you could grow. The men at the store heard about the hay twists and laughed until they had to sit down. Burning grass to heat dirt. It was the best joke of the autumn. She dug her cellar into the same rise the house stood on, straight back through the west wall, and shelved it with planks from the wagon box. Potatoes, turnips, cabbages in sand, 2 crocks of salted pork bought with 3 of her dollars, a barrel of rye flour, coffee, sugar, a can of kerosene. She strung a rope from her door to the well and another from the door to the lean-to, and Vogel's customers heard about the ropes too, ropes, in September, and found them as funny as the hay. Only one thing that autumn shook her, and the valley never knew about it, because she never told anybody. Late in October it rained for 3 days. A cold, gray, soaking rain, and on the second night the new roof began to weep. Not everywhere, along the ridge, where the sod had not yet knitted, but enough that muddy water spotted the cheesecloth and dripped on Ingrid's quilt. And Ada Lindvis sat up till morning with pans catching the leaks, doing the one thing she allowed herself in place of despair, which was counting. So many twists of hay, so many pounds of flour, so many weeks to solstice. In the morning she climbed up and relayed the ridge line, lapped the sods double like shingles, and packed the seams with clay from the cellar digging. And when the November rains came, the roof held dry. She wrote the whole business in pencil in the margin of her almanac, in Swedish, the same almanac where she kept her counts. If the winter was going to examine her, she meant to have shown her work. Miss Fenwick, meanwhile, showed hers. In November, the teachers stood up at the Literary Society in her white new house. The society met there, it being the finest room for miles in any direction, and read aloud from a housekeeping journal on the subject of earthen dwellings. Damp, the journal said. Vapors, unfit for children of a delicate constitution. She did not name anyone. Everyone looked at nobody in a manner that named someone. Then winter shut down over the valley, November hardening into December, and the two houses stood a quarter-mile apart on the open grass like an argument waiting for its judge. The white one, milled and painted and shingled, propped against the sky, and the low brown one, half sunk into its rise, with grass roots for mortar and a rope running to the well. December was cold and clear and quiet, cold enough that the men stopped joking and started hauling wood in earnest. Ada fed her stove its twists of hay morning and evening, watched her cord of river wood barely shrink, and marked the days off in the almanac. Rusk grew a coat like a sheep. Ingrid stopped mentioning the teacher's house. On the last Sunday of the year, the sun rose the color of a peach through a sky of standing frost needles, and the old Brant grandmother, who had crossed 2 oceans and read weather the old way, looked at that sun and told her son to chain the cattle shed shut and double his rope to the barn. Sundogs all that week. A ring around the moon you could have driven a wagon through. The air had a waiting in it. The storm the old woman smelled arrived on the 9th of January, a little after noon, on a day that began so warm and blue that half the valley had gone out coatless to their stock and their wood sledges. What came for them out of the northwest that afternoon is still written up in the county history, and the county history calls it the hardest 3 days the valley ever kept a record of. It announced itself as a line. Men who lived through it described the same thing. A low, dark blue band lying on the northwest horizon at midday, flat as a ruled mark, and beneath it a white smoke that seemed to boil along the ground. There was almost no warning gap. One farmer said he watched the line swallow the Brant windmill, counted to 60, and then could not see his own barn. The temperature fell like a dropped stone. Men who had been sweating in shirt sleeves at noon were facing a wind at 10 below zero by chore time, and it kept falling through the dark until the spirit thermometers read 22 below. But the cold was never the killer on the open plains. The killer was the wind. It came in straight off 1,000 miles of nothing, a steady push near 60 miles an hour with fists in it, and it did not gust and rest the whole first night. It picked the snow up off the ground, ground it fine as flour against itself, and drove it level through the dark, so that a lantern at arm's length showed as a smudge, and a man crossing his own dooryard without a rope was simply gone. That wind found every seam in the valley, and the valley, it turned out, was mostly seams. In the White House a quarter-mile from Ada's, Miss Fenwick did everything a capable, well-read woman could do, and none of it was enough, because the problem was not her competence. The problem was the building. Board and batten walls are as skin, and the skin had shrunk all through the dry December, and now the wind stood against the northwest wall and pressed until the whole frame leaned and worked like a ship. She could watch the wallpaper breathe. Fine snow came in where she could not find a crack, through the keyhole in a spray, up between the floorboards, around every window sash, until small drifts grew on the inside sills and would not melt, because 6 feet from her stove the room could not hold the heat to melt them. She burned wood that first night the whole night through, feeding the firebox as fast as it would take it, and near morning she did what she had been trained to do. She took a reading and wrote it down. Her good spirit thermometer, hung on the parlor wall of the finest new house in that end of the valley, with the stove roaring 6 feet away, read 22 degrees, 10 below freezing, indoors, beside the fire. She wrote the figure in her notebook because the writing of it was the only thing in the house still under her control. The second morning the stovepipe went. The wind had been worrying it for a day and a night where it passed through the roof, and a gust bent the joint, and the pipe above the damper tore loose and went off the shingles like a shot bird. Smoke doubled back and filled the room. The fire had to be drowned with wash water, and the moment the fire died the house began to die with it. That fast the temperature indoors started walking down toward the temperature outdoors, and Miss Fenwick, who had read what happens to people who fall asleep in that kind of cold, made the coldest and clearest decision of her life. She could stay in a dead house, or she could cross a quarter-mile of open ground in a wind she could not stand up in, toward a neighbor she had publicly called a danger to her own child. She went along the fence line, and the fence line saved her. It was Ada's fence. Ada had strung it in November from her dooryard corner post out along the section line, and the men had found the November fence about as funny as the September ropes. Miss Fenwick went hand over hand, post to post, a woman crawling most of it, her notebook and the thermometer buttoned inside her coat, her face wrapped in a shawl that iced solid in front of her mouth. It took her most of an hour to go a quarter of a mile. When she reached the low mound where the corner post stood, she could not see a house at all. The soddy was drifted to its eaves on the storm side, a white whale back with the wind smoking off its spine. But under the wind she heard, muffled and impossible, a dog barking, and she followed the barking downhill to a door in the snow. Rusk had heard her at the wall, afterward telling it she always started there, that she had been received into the earth by a dog. Ada pulled her inside, the wind slammed the door for them, and the schoolteacher stood in the sudden quiet, snow-white as a loaf of sugar from head to foot, and could not for a moment understand what her own senses were reporting. It was warm, not survivable. Warm, the room was white and still. The lamp burned without leaning. Bread stood rising in pans on the shelf above the stove, and the stove, this was the detail she told for the rest of her life, the stove was burning quietly. One modest fire, not roaring, with a stack of grass twists beside it and a small wood box that looked hardly touched. Ingrid sat on the bed with a reader open on her knees. The dog shook himself and lay back down on the rug. The storm that was pulling the valley's houses apart board by board was, in that room, a sound. A big sound, like a river heard from inside a hill. But only a sound. The 3 feet of packed earth around her did not shudder, and did not breathe, and did not let one thread of that wind through. Because there was nothing for the wind to hold, the walls had no seams left to find. The wind could take the whole valley in its hands, but this one house it could not pick up, because this one house was not standing on the prairie. It was part of it. When her hands had thought enough to obey her, Miss Fenwick did the thing that turned a rescue into a verdict. She unbuttoned her coat, took out the thermometer that an hour before had read 22 degrees beside her own roaring stove, and hung it on a peg in the whitewashed sod wall. Then the two women drank coffee and watched it, not speaking, while the mercury of the storm was overruled in front of them. The reading settled at 58 degrees, one small fire in a house made of dirt. She took out her notebook, wrote the second figure under the first, and looked at the numbers for a long time. 2 houses, a quarter of a mile and 36 degrees apart, in the same storm. She had it in her own handwriting, from her own instrument. There was nothing in her journals to argue with that. "I said things about this house," she said at last. "You will stay in it until the wind is done," Ada said, and put a bowl in front of her, and that was the entire quarrel, settled. The storm blew all that night and all the next day, and stopped in the third night the abrupt door shut of prairie storms. Men said you could tell the hour it died, because the silence woke them like a noise. All through those days, up and down the valley, families fought their houses to a draw or lost. The Vogel's stovepipe wire snapped the second night, and the family finished the storm in the cellar under quilts, the store-bought parlor above them given up to the snow that sifted in through the sprung seams and lay unmelting on the good carpet. The Brants kept their fire alive, but their woodpile was adrift they could not find. And old Brant spent the last day splitting a wardrobe and 2 chairs with a hatchet indoors, feeding furniture to the stove while the grandmother sat wrapped with the children and named every storm she had outlived, as if the list itself were fuel. Nobody in the valley died, and that was luck as much as anything. The storm had come after the school hour, and no one had been caught far on the road. But when the third night went quiet, there was hardly a plank building in that corner of the county still tight, still warm, and still sure of itself. And everyone under all those iced roofs lay awake in the ringing silence, doing the same arithmetic about wood and cold and the rest of January. The morning after a great blizzard is the brightest thing this world does. The sky came up blue as deep water, without one cloud in it, and the sun stood over a valley that had no fences, no roads, no dooryards, a single white sea of carved drifts, with the tops of cedar posts showing here and there like the heads of swimmers, and the houses buried to their windows, and the cold sitting on all of it at 20 below, patient, in no hurry at all. Out of that whole white valley, one column of smoke stood up straight into the blue. The valley dug itself out slowly, the digging of people who already knew what they were going to find. Doors had to be forced against packed drift. Men climbed out through windows and stood on their own roofs to get their bearings, and what they saw from those roofs they talked about into their old age. Every homestead in sight was a gray, smokeless hump. The Vogels came up out of their cellar into a parlor where the carpet crunched underfoot and the water pail by the door had frozen to the bottom. Indoors, 10 steps from the stove they had fed all storm. The Brants' kitchen was scattered with the wreck of the wardrobe and both chairs, and their thermometer, when the grandmother thumbed the frost off it, read 11 degrees inside the house. Cattle had drifted with the wind and stood buried to their backs against the fence lines. The whole valley smelled of cold iron and nothing else, because nothing else has a smell at 20 below. And through all of it, drawing every eye in that white morning, the smoke went up from the low mound south of the river, thick and steady and unhurried, the smoke of a fire that had never once gone out. They came to it that same morning, and they came, without anyone arranging it, almost together. Vogel and his eldest son on the horse they had dug free, old Brant on foot with a shovel over his shoulder. 2 more men from along the section road, wading and floundering the last stretch where the drifts lay carved in shoulder-high waves. The house itself they could hardly find. The storm side was buried to the roofline, one white curve among the white curves, and only the dooryard face stood clear, the deep-set door and the two small windows glowing amber in the shadowed snow, and the smoke standing up out of the drift like a flag over a fort that had not fallen. Vogel's son said afterward that the strangest part was the quiet of it. Every other dooryard in the valley that morning rang with hatchets and shouting. This one smelled of bread. Vogel knocked. It was a strange, small, formal sound in all that white silence, a town knock, and the men stood behind him in the snow with their hats going off their heads more or less on their own. The door opened inward, and the warmth rolled out over them, an actual wave of it, carrying the smell of rye bread and coffee and lime and lamp oil, and Ada Lindfist stood in the doorway with her sleeves rolled, looking at the frozen delegation exactly as she had once looked at a man with his thumbs in his vest, asking why she would bury her child in dirt. "We saw your smoke," Vogel said. His voice was not working quite right, and he stopped and started it again. "Ours is out. Everybody's is out, the length of the valley." "Then you had better come in," Ada said, and stood aside. They came in stamping and blinking, and then they stopped, all of them, in the middle of the room and turned around slowly, and the turning around was the verdict. The whitewashed walls threw the lamplight soft over everything. The cheesecloth ceiling was taut and clean. Ingrid was setting out cups without being told. The dog was lying against a stove that ticked with one quiet fire. The bread stood in brown loaves on the shelf, and on its peg in the wall hung Miss Fenwick's thermometer, which the men filed past one at a time, each reading it for himself, nobody saying anything. 58 degrees. Old Brandt put his bare palm flat against the inside of the wall and held it there, 3 feet of earth between his hand and the murdering cold, and the wall was faintly, patiently warm. And he said something in his own language and shook his head, and did not translate it. Miss Fenwick translated instead. She stood by the stove where she had spent the storm, opened her notebook, and read the 2 figures out loud to the room, because she was a teacher and it was, after all, a lesson. 22 degrees beside my stove, with the fire roaring and the house tearing itself loose, she said. 58 beside hers, with one small fire of twisted hay. I measured both myself with the same instrument. I intend to write to the journal that told me dirt was unfit for children. Vogel stood looking into the fire door of that modest stove for a long moment, at the grass burning where his cordwood arithmetic said grass had no business burning, and everyone at the store had it by heart within the week, because his son repeated it to the end of his days. Harlan Vogel took his hat all the terrible rest of the distance off his head and said, quietly, like a man reciting scripture he had laughed at in church, "Dirt doesn't burn wood. She fed them." That is the part the valley chose to remember, and the part worth remembering. Not a speech. There was no speech. She never in her life made one, but the long table board laid across 2 trestles, and the brown loaves cut down the middle, still warm, and butter, and coffee poured hot and black into every cup the house owned, and then into 2 the Vogel's boy ran back over the drifts to fetch. The men who had called her house the Gopher Hole sat inside its 3-foot walls in stocking feet with their coats steaming on pegs, eating rye bread with cold, cracked hands, while their own kitchens stood frozen a mile up the road. And Ada moved down the table, refilling cups exactly as though the whole thing were ordinary, which, in the country she came from, it was. When the woman from the near quarter asked her, half whispering, what it had been like inside the dirt during the worst of it, Ada considered the question honestly. "Loud," she said, "like standing behind a waterfall. We slept. They had not slept. Nobody else in the valley had slept. The word went up and down the section roads with the ring of legend. By the time the drifts had settled enough for sleighs, the storm had beaten every house in the valley but one, and the one was made of dirt, and the widow inside it had baked bread through the middle of it, and the schoolteacher had the figures written down in ink. Silas Crane made his stand at Vogel's counter in February, because a lumber agent cannot afford a winter like that to pass into legend unanswered. He came in, stamping the snow off good boots, put his back to the stove, and made his case to the room at large, reasonably the same voice that had sold half of them their seams. "One storm proves nothing," he said. "Frame houses stand from here to Chicago by the 100,000. A blizzard is an act of God, gentlemen. You will not seriously tell me that white men in the age of the railroad mean to live in the ground like badgers." "My parlor stood at 22 degrees with the stove roaring, Silas," Vogel said, from behind his own counter, not raising his voice. "There is still snow in my carpet that has not thought it worth melting." Her kitchen held 58 on twisted hay. "You sold me the parlor, and you wanted to sell her one too, on credit, at your interest. Any frame house wants proper banking, storm cellars, tar paper." "The storm was not confused, Silas," old Brant said from the cracker barrel, without turning around. "Only you are." The room did not laugh at Crane. It did something worse. It went back to its business and let him stand there by the stove, holding a case nobody was buying, and in March he closed the office by the lumber yard and took the spring train for Omaha, where, it was said, the weather was more reasonably disposed toward men who sold walls 1 inch thick. The proof of what the valley had decided came with the thaw, and it did not come as talk. It came as plows. The first was the Brant boy, 17 that spring, who walked the 2 miles on a Sunday in April and stood in Ada's dooryard turning his cap in his hands until she came out. "My father did not send me," he said. "He does not know I am here. Will you show me how you cut the blocks before he loses another winter to that stove?" She showed him. She walked him down her old furrows and showed him the 4-inch cut and the 2-foot block, how to read the sod for root, why the wall wants its grass turned down and its seams crossed, how deep to set a window so the wall can settle past it, everything the almanac margins held. And when old Brant came himself a week later, gruff and sideways about it, he refused to take the breaking plow back home with him. "Keep it," he said, looking at the house instead of her. "It was never used this well while it was ours." By the time the meadowlarks were back, 3 plows were cutting sod within sight of her door. The Brants, the Vogels, and one belonging to the family from the near quarter, and the low brown walls rising on 3 claims that spring were laid grass side down in double courses, seams crossed, windows set deep, because their builders had stood inside the original with their palms on the wall and were not interested in improving on what had kept its people warm through the worst 3 days in the county's books. When the school district met that summer to replace the drafty frame schoolhouse, Miss Fenwick read her 2 figures into the minutes, and the district voted a sod school with walls 3 feet through, and nobody at the meeting so much as smiled. The nickname did not survive the year. Nobody could say just when the gopher hole died out of use, but by the next winter. When a claim changed hands anywhere in that county, the seller would point across the grass and say the house was sod, built the right style, warm through the deep cold. And what he said, the phrase that became the county's word for any house that could be trusted with a family in January, was that it was a Lindfist house. Men who had never met her said it. Ingrid heard it said all her life, long after she was grown, by people who no longer knew it was a woman's name, the house that the worst blizzard in the county's memory could not touch. The house that fed its laughers. The house made of dirt. Ada Lindqvist lived in hers for 30 more years and never once explained herself further than the 4 words she had spent on Harlan Vogel in September. She did not need to. People rarely remembered the laughter. What survived were the things that worked.